I was 20 years old when it happened. Fresh out of college, bright-eyed, and excited to finally land a real job. It wasn't glamorous, entry-level assistant at a mid-sized marketing firm, but to me, it was everything. My first step into adulthood, independence, and building a career. The office was sleek, modern, and buzzing with energy. Everyone seemed to know their place. The executives strutted around in designer suits. The sales reps laughed too loud in the break room. And me. I was just happy to be there, clutching my little desk mug like it was a trophy. But from the very first day, I noticed something strange about my boss, Melissa. She was in her late 30s, sharp bob haircut, always in heels that clicked against the marble floors. At first, I admired her. She seemed powerful, confident, the kind of woman I thought I wanted to become. But the admiration didn't last long. Melissa had a way of making you feel both noticed and uncomfortable. She would lean over my desk just a little too close. Her eyes would linger on me when I spoke in meetings. She'd compliment me in ways that felt more personal than professional. "Wow," she'd say with a smile. "You clean up nice. Our clients are going to love you." I laughed it off at first, thinking maybe she was just friendly. But then she started making comments in front of others. At a team lunch, she introduced me by saying, "This is our newest hire. She's young, ambitious, and knows how to charm people. Clients are already eating out of her hand." The room chuckled. I forced a smile. But inside, I squirmed. It wasn't true. I hadn't even spoken to any clients yet. She was planting an idea, one that made me sound flirty, unprofessional, like I was using my looks instead of my skills. And that idea would come back to haunt me. One afternoon, about 2 weeks in, I was called into her office. She shut the door, sat me down, and smiled in that too perfect way. "I just want to give you some advice," she said. "You're doing great work, but you need to be careful." "Careful?" I asked, confused. "With the clients," she said, tilting her head. "You don't want to give the wrong impression. Some of them might think you're interested." My face burned. I haven't even." She waved her hand. "I'm just saying. You're very approachable. That's good for sales, but HR doesn't like gray areas." I nodded, stunned into silence. It was the first time she hinted at something that wasn't true. But not the last. Weeks went by. I buried myself in work, trying to prove I was competent. I stayed late, double-checked my reports, volunteered for projects. And clients actually liked me, not because I flirted, but because I listened, remembered details, and delivered results. But Melissa's comments got bolder. At a networking event, she introduced me as our secret weapon. She flashes that smile, and contracts practically sign themselves. Everyone laughed. My stomach twisted. Later that night, one of the older male clients cornered me at the bar. "So," he smirked, "are you really as persuasive as your boss says?" I excused myself immediately, heart pounding. Melissa had created this image of me that I couldn't control. And it was about to explode. It happened on a Tuesday. Normal morning. Coffee, emails, the usual. Until I got a message. "Melissa wants to see you. Now." I walked into her office, and HR was there too. My stomach dropped. Melissa's expression was cold this time. No smile. No friendliness. Just a calculated glare. "We've had some concerns," she began. "Multiple clients have reported inappropriate behavior. Flirting. Crossing boundaries. This is unacceptable." My jaw dropped. "What? That's not true." HR cleared their throat, reading from a folder. "We've received emails suggesting you were overly personal during meetings, lingering touches, comments." Comments. I choked out. "I've never." Melissa leaned forward, feigning sadness. We wanted to give you a chance. But this is serious. Effective immediately. You're terminated. And just like that, my world collapsed. Guys, imagine being 20 years old, fired on the spot, your reputation shattered, all because of lies. I walked out of that building numb, humiliated, convinced my career was over before it had even started. But what Melissa didn't know was that she had just messed with the wrong person. Because hidden in the company servers, in HR's own emails, was proof that everything she accused me of was a cover-up for something far darker. And when I found it, her entire company came crashing down. After that humiliating termination, I went home in a daze. I stared at the ceiling all night, trying to process how quickly my life had been derailed. My resume, my reputation, my future, all seemed like they had been ripped from my hands. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. And most of all, I couldn't stop thinking about Melissa. She had accused me of flirting, of being unprofessional. But deep down, I knew it wasn't true. I had done nothing wrong. Everything I had done was above board, professional, and honest. I decided to take a small comfort in organization. I opened my personal laptop and logged into my old company email account, the one HR had forgotten to deactivate immediately. I just wanted to download my personal contacts, maybe get closure. And that's when I saw it. Emails. Hundreds of them. All from HR, all regarding complaints Melissa had supposedly received from clients. But as I read through them carefully, something didn't add up. Every complaint had timestamps that matched times when Melissa had been in the room, on calls, or even with me in meetings. Every accusation was vague, none of the clients were named, and every email trail pointed back to one person, her. My heart pounded. I leaned closer. This wasn't just a firing. This was a cover-up. Melissa had created fake complaints, altered emails, and used HR to make me look like the guilty one. I began cross-referencing. I checked calendar invites, call logs, and internal communications. Each HR email, validating client complaints, conveniently coincided with Melissa's private meetings, coffee breaks, or business lunches. She had meticulously planned this. It wasn't just a bad boss mistake, it was intentional sabotage. I was never fired for flirting. I was fired because Melissa felt threatened. My work ethic, my charm with clients, my reliability, all of it made her insecure. And she wanted to eliminate the competition, without touching her own reputation. Then I found the real smoking gun, an email chain between Melissa and the HR manager. Melissa wrote, "Make sure the complaints look genuine. No one can know I'm behind it. She's smart, but she's young. We need her gone." And the HR manager replied, "Understood. I've drafted emails and will adjust timestamps to match client activity. No one will suspect a thing." I read it 3 times. My stomach churned. The betrayal was monumental. My own boss, abusing HR protocols, manipulating evidence, and framing me for things I had never done. It wasn't just unfair, it was criminal. And suddenly, the humiliation I felt walking out of that office turned into rage. As I processed everything, my emotions were a whirlwind. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and powerless. I had been fired for false accusations, and my career was on hold. People might have assumed I was guilty. But under all that rage and hurt, a spark ignited, the spark of revenge. Not impulsive revenge, mind you. Calculated, intelligent revenge. A way to turn the tables, expose her lies, and reclaim everything I had lost. By the end of that night, I had a plan forming. Melissa thought she had won. She thought I was broken. She didn't know that the emails were my key, my ticket to exposing her. And the best part? She had no idea that her company's downfall was about to start, all because of her own lies. Next time, guys, I'll tell you exactly how I turned those emails into the most shocking revenge my career has ever seen. You won't believe what happened next. Trust me, it's a story you'll want to watch until the very end. After I found the HR emails, the first few days were a chemical storm. I alternated between trembling and burning. I'd wake up convinced I was in a nightmare and then terrified to fall asleep because the next day might be worse. The humiliation of being called unprofessional was the easy part. The worst was the knowledge that someone I'd respected, someone I'd wanted to be like, had fabricated a trail of lies to ruin me. I walked past the office windows and pressed my palm to the glass like I could physically push my name back into the company. Cars streamed by, people chatted on the sidewalks, and life went on. Inside me, however, nothing was normal. My phone buzzed with sympathetic messages from old coworkers, some real, some performative. My inbox was full of job alerts and templated empathy. But only one thing pulsed through my veins: proof. Proof is a heavy thing. It gives you options. It gives you voice. For the first time since being fired, the adrenaline tasted electric and righteous. I wasn't going to curl into a corner and let a manufactured narrative define me. I was going to fight smart. The first practical step was legal counsel. I knew nothing about lawsuits beyond what I'd seen in movies, but I knew two things for sure. Fabricated HR records were actionable, and if I wanted to win, I needed a lawyer who could translate pixels and emails into legal weight. I called a friend from university who had interned at a law firm and asked for a referral. She recommended someone sharp, a labor attorney who took cases for people who'd been railroaded. I scheduled a consultation that same week, swinging between hope and dread. The office smelled like coffee and old books. The attorney, Ms. Rivera, was in her mid-40s with cropped hair and a no-nonsense stare. I laid everything out: copies of the HR emails, the timestamps, the calendar invites, the drafts showing Melissa's, make it look genuine line. I gave her a timeline I'd compiled: dates, meetings, witnesses. She read, tapped her pen, and then said, "This is prosecutable. It's a very strong case for wrongful termination and defamation. We can also look into negligent HR practices. You have the smoking gun. Someone coordinated to fabricate evidence." At that moment, relief and fear collided. Relief because someone competent validated my conclusion. Fear because litigation means exposure, public scrutiny, and the possibility that the courtroom could be another stage for Melissa's charisma. But the attorney reassured me, "We do this by the book. No theatrics. We'll use facts. You did the work, so we'll make the facts speak." We signed an engagement agreement, and I felt prepared for the first time since I lost my job. Legal counsel was step one. Step two was fortifying the evidence pile until it was bulletproof. I started by printing everything. I organized copies in numbered folders. Folder A, HR correspondence. Folder B, calendar comparisons showing Melissa's presence. Folder C, witness statements. Folder D, client communications that were real and benign. I even backed up the digital copies in 3 secure locations and encrypted them. Then I dug deeper. Melissa's arrogance had left a breadcrumb trail. She'd CC'd herself on messages meant for other managers. She'd used uniquely phrased lines I was able to search for in company chats and find in multiple places. I compiled a list of inconsistencies, small things that, strung together, created a portrait of orchestration. I reached out to former colleagues one by one, not for gossip but for corroboration. Some were afraid to get involved. Some told me they'd noticed oddities but hadn't realized how far things went. One junior account manager, Daniel, agreed to speak to my lawyer. Daniel had seen Melissa draft complaint templates weeks before anyone complained. He'd thought it was a clumsy attempt at compliance. When I played those recorded snippets for Ms. Rivera, she smiled thinly. "You're getting solid." I also contacted clients I'd actually worked with. These conversations were difficult at first. Who wants to be dragged into a workplace mess? But most were gracious and quick to say, "No, I never complained. She might be confused." A few were shocked but promised to cooperate. Those client statements showed the accusations were not only fabricated but convenient. Planning revenge, legal revenge, is emotionally exhausting. Unlike a cinematic montage, the work is tedious, precise, and filled with long waits. There were days I felt monstrous for enjoying the idea of striking back. There were nights when I sat on the kitchen floor and simply sobbed. The shame and grief had to be acknowledged. I bought a small notebook and wrote every hurt down, the humiliating firings, the whispers, the way my mother's voice had sounded when I told her. Naming the pain helped me compartmentalize. I also set boundaries. I gave myself 1 hour a day to spiral. Sad songs, the raw emotion. Then I made a rule. The rest of the day was action-oriented. That compartmentalization turned anxiety into fuel. I trained myself to be patient. Revenge in this form required patience. We were playing chess while she expected a brawl. I began small rituals. Every time I filed another piece of evidence, I lit a candle. It sounds dramatic, but it reminded me that I was reclaiming control. Rituals anchor you when the world feels untethered. Ms. Rivera and I outlined a 3-pronged strategy: legal action, controlled public exposure, and psychological containment. We would hit where it mattered and avoid theatrics that might make the court and the public sympathize with Melissa again. Legal. File a wrongful termination lawsuit backed by the HR emails, client statements, and witness affidavits. We'd seek damages for lost wages, emotional distress, and punitive damages for willful misconduct. Controlled public exposure. We'd prepare a press packet to be released if certain events occurred, if Melissa tried to bury the story or HR retaliated. The packet included redacted emails, a timeline, and verified witness statements. This was not about sensationalism. It was about ensuring the truth had a controlled narrative that wouldn't be hijacked by Melissa's charm. Psychological containment. Prepare for gaslighting. Melissa would likely claim manipulation, edited emails, or a vendetta. I documented everything meticulously, so there was no room for, he said, she said. As a legal backup, Ms. Rivera filed for preliminary discovery, meaning the company had to produce certain documents under court order. This step was vital. If the company refused, we could force disclosure. If they complied, the emails confirming the conspiracy would be on record. It was a legal sledgehammer. Once discovery was filed, the waiting was maddening. Legal processes are slow, and Melissa continued to work as if nothing hung over her. She strutted around the office, fielded client calls, and occasionally sent smirking emails to people who'd supported her. For someone orchestrating a smear, she was foolishly visible. That visibility created openings I could exploit. Ms. Rivera suggested a psychological move: plant small but telling questions in informal conversations with people who interacted with Melissa. If enough people noticed the pattern, her anonymity in complaints, her templated language, collective doubt would erode her standing before the court even started. It wasn't manipulation, it was truth-seeding. I also prepared my testimony. I practiced in front of a mirror, answering hostile questions calmly. I recorded myself speaking so I could watch signs of emotion and control them. The goal was not to become a stone statue. It was to be credible, articulate, and undeniably honest. 2 weeks into discovery, a small victory arrived. The company produced an earlier set of HR logs, unredacted. There, like a neon sign, were messages between Melissa and the HR manager. Not just requests, but instructions. Her voice, casual and commanding in internal chats, said, "Make sure none of her performance reviews are stored in a way that could protect her." An HR manager replied with a thumbs-up emoji. When I saw the thread, I sat back so hard I nearly fell. This was not a he said, she said anymore. This was a pattern of deliberate erasure. Ms. Rivera smiled for the first time in weeks. You boys and girls in management think you can press delete on people's lives. You can't. The law's got memory. But we didn't gloat. We built. We drafted affidavits. We prepped depositions. We scheduled depositions for Melissa and HR. The day those depositions were served, I felt a mix of dread and exhilaration. This was the moment the truth met her voice directly. The night before Melissa's deposition, I barely slept. I sat with my folders spread out, the dim glow of the desk lamp turning paper into pages of fate. I thought about every insult, every cold look, every small humiliation that had shaped my fury. I thought about the life I wanted and the one I'd been denied. Momentarily, yes, but irreparably scarred. I will not be erased, I told myself aloud. Not by her, not by her company, not by anyone. And because fate has a sense of theatrical timing, that was where we paused, where I collected myself before launching into the next act. The deposition would be a battlefield. My lawyer told me to rest my voice and armor my truth. The day of Melissa's deposition, the conference room felt like a stage. White walls, a long table, a recorder blinking red like a watcher. Her PR-perfect smile was in place, but the practiced ease had thin spots. She arrived with a glossy folder and a lawyer who looked like he'd rehearsed righteous indignation for a living. Ms. Rivera sat across from them with the folder of evidence that had become my lifeline. Cameras weren't allowed in depositions, but the staccato rhythm of a court reporter's fingers had its own documentary quality. The room buzzed with contained energy, the kind that previews things you can't unsee. "State your name for the record," the reporter intoned. Melissa complied. Then the questions came. Where were you on the dates of these alleged complaints? Who initiated the emails? Why did you suggest altering timestamps? Each question was simple. Yes/no, date, fact, but each answer carried weight. At first, Melissa deflected. She smiled. She suggested miscommunication. But then Ms. Rivera laid out the chain, the draft templates, the sent messages, the calendar invites that placed Melissa at the exact moments she'd engineered. The tape of her fingers on the keyboard, the emails, were literal handwriting distilled into pixels. You suggested the HR manager make complaints look genuine, Ms. Rivera asked, sliding a printed email across the table. Melissa's face flickered. The lawyer started to pivot, to reframe. Ms. Thompson, that's taken out of context, he began. Please read the email aloud for the record, Ms. Rivera said calmly. Melissa's voice wavered as she read her own words back. Hearing herself admit to instructing HR was like watching a person discover a betrayal in their reflection. Her denials began to fray. When people are forced to speak their own lies, the lies often suffocate. By the time the deposition ended, there were several moments where Melissa's supposed confidence collapsed into excuses about stress, poor judgment, and panicked decisions. Her lawyer tried to contain it, to present her as a leader who made a bad call. But the emails had teeth. They were precise and unambiguous. When she left the room, she was pale. Her fiancé was waiting outside and tried to hug her, but she kept her distance, like someone who suddenly remembered they were guilty. Discovery is a legal term that sounds boring until you remember it means forcing the other side to hand over everything. And once a court orders production, people with secrets can't just delete them without consequences. The company complied, partly because they had to, partly because they thought cleaning up would look cleaner. But their production included internal memos, Slack threads, and HR tickets that made a crime novel look amateurish. There were lines where managers joked about finding a boogeyman to explain personnel problems. There were performance reviews that had been oddly lost and then found in new formats. There was a bizarre internal note suggesting a PR narrative should be woven to maintain stakeholder confidence. One file in particular made the entire legal team breathe audibly, a chain of Slack messages between Melissa and the HR manager, where they joked about wrapping up the matter and saving face. They used emojis like people scheduling brunch. The tone was casual, terrifyingly casual, for people discussing fabricating evidence against an employee. Ms. Rivera slid the Slack thread across the desk and said, "This is beyond negligence. This is conspiracy." We requested depositions from multiple managers. Some panicked and testified in ways that hurt the company more than helped. One mid-level manager admitted, under oath, that he had been instructed to sanitize files about my performance. The deposition transcripts began to circulate quietly among board members, and then, predictably, someone leaked to the small local business blog that covered office gossip. When a quiet leak hits the right person, it becomes a story. Once a story becomes unignorable, the company begins hemorrhaging trust. We had planned public exposure carefully. Ms. Rivera advised caution. Lawyers know the court of public opinion is volatile. But when you have an entire company's internal culture revealed in unflattering documents, you don't need to sensationalize. The truth will do the work. We prepared a press packet, redacted HR emails, the Slack thread, the deposition excerpts, and a clear timeline. The idea was not to humiliate for spectacle, but to ensure transparency. The packet was emailed to a local business reporter and 2 larger outlets known for investigative pieces. We included verified statements from clients who confirmed they never complained. The reporters were hungry. Headlines ran within 48 hours. Allegations of fabricated HR complaints rock mid-sized marketing firm. The story quoted lines from the Slack thread and the deposition. It was careful, sourced, and devastating. Clients began calling their account reps with questions. One major client, uncomfortable with the optics of doing business with a firm that might fabricate internal allegations, paused negotiations for a large campaign. News travels fast in business circles. Contracts that were weeks from signing were put on hold. The company's stock, small though it was, took a hit. Investors started asking for emergency meetings. The CEO, who had been already skirting issues with leadership, was suddenly in the hot seat. Board members who'd previously ignored HR complaints now read transcripts in boardroom meetings with mobile phones capturing their reactions. The PR team issued a statement that tried to strike a balance. We take all employee complaints seriously and are conducting an internal review. That phrase, repeated, felt more like a prayer than a plan. Public relations can build facades, but it can't erase a trail of emails. Business is confidence. When trust breaks, the pipeline slows. Clients started asking for audits of other accounts. Some requested immediate reassignment of account managers. A handful quietly terminated contracts to avoid reputational risk. Then the big blow, a flagship client, one that generated a significant portion of the company's revenue, publicly paused their campaign. They issued a statement about reassessing vendor relationships while quietly letting their legal team audit contracts. When other clients saw this, they too paused. Within 3 weeks, the company lost enough revenue that the CFO called an emergency meeting. The stock price dipped further as analysts began raising questions about governance. The board demanded a special investigation into HR practices and senior management oversight. The CEO, who had been insulated by charisma and quarterly reports, suddenly had to answer for the culture he'd allowed. Internally, morale cratered. Employees who'd laughed at office gossip now worried about layoffs, severance packages, and future job prospects. The firm's glossy brand eroded into a cautionary tale. Recruitment froze. Lost talent drains a company slowly and painfully. Board meetings are where image meets accountability. When the board convened, armed with transcripts and client notes, the veneer melted. Several directors, previously loyal to Melissa's leadership, started asking the kinds of blunt questions that had an immediate sting. Did she misrepresent client feedback? Who authorized HR changes? Why weren't performance files archived properly? One board member, a quiet but influential investor, read out the Slack message that referenced saving face. He looked up and asked, plainly, "Is this how senior management operates?" The CEO stumbled through answers that sounded rehearsed. The board voted to place Melissa on administrative leave pending a full independent investigation. It was a decisive move, not exactly termination, but the first official sign that the company would not protect her. Melissa's fiancé, who had been one of her staunchest defenders, withdrew from public advocacy. Loyalty had limits when reputational and legal liabilities were at stake. The independent investigation confirmed what the emails and depositions had suggested, a pattern of manipulated documentation and attempts to control narratives at the expense of employees. The board convened again and, in a move the town would talk about for months, terminated Melissa for cause. Her termination letter cited willful orchestration of personnel actions and breach of company ethics. Watching that announcement land felt surreal. It wasn't about schadenfreude. It was about seeing justice for the abuse of power. I won't pretend it felt like victory at once. It felt heavy, like watching an old tree fall. But it also felt like the air cleared a little. We didn't gloat. We didn't release juicy clips for clicks. We let the legal process and the resulting corporate actions speak. But the public narrative had already shifted. Articles chronicled the steps, the firing, the client exodus, the board coup. Industry commentaries discussed governance and the danger of charismatic leaders who manipulate systems. Slow, inevitable consequences accrued. Clients who had paused negotiations either moved to competitors or demanded strict oversight. Recruitment calls dried up. The firm had to issue a public apology and initiate a long, expensive cultural rebuild that included a new HR chief, compliance training, and third-party audits. This kind of remediation is costly and sustained. For a company with thin margins and dependent clients, it's almost impossible to weather without losing momentum. The firm's brand never fully recovered. New leadership tried to salvage value, but the damage to trust was structural. While their house of cards was collapsing, I'd been quietly meeting with recruiters. The reputation I'd built before the firing, being reliable, client-focused, and detail-oriented, didn't vanish. It had simply been clouded by lies. A forward-thinking firm in another city reached out after reading the coverage. They wanted someone who could handle pressure, had integrity, and knew how to manage client relationships. They offered me a role that wasn't just a job, it was a career pivot. Senior account manager with a clear path to leadership. It came with a windowed office I never dreamed I'd have and, more importantly, a team that respected me for my work rather than gossiped about rumors. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was promoted into a corner office because someone else destroyed her credibility. My revenge was not just a lawsuit or public vindication. It was living a better life and letting truth and competence do the rest. After Melissa's termination and the company's collapse, I expected satisfaction. But it wasn't fireworks or applause. Instead, there was quiet. Surreal quiet. The firm's clients were reassigning accounts, HR was overhauled, and industry articles quietly chronicled the scandal. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Karma had done most of the work. I got emails and calls from former coworkers. Some were apologetic, some were defensive, a few were just curious about the fallout. It was strange, being recognized for integrity and perseverance after being humiliated. For the first time in months, I felt vindicated. Meanwhile, my new job blossomed. The promotion, the respect from my team, the opportunities to lead projects, these weren't just professional wins. They were personal. I realized revenge isn't always about watching someone fail. Sometimes it's about elevating yourself beyond their reach. I decorated my corner office with personal touches, framed certificates I'd earned, and occasionally glanced at the view, thinking how far I'd come from the humiliation of being called unprofessional in front of my peers. Melissa had tried to bury me, but instead, she had inadvertently cleared the path for my success.